Okay, so I'm, sorry, my app has just done something odd. It's supposed to be a clock, and it wants to be a flashlight. No, cancel. Yes, thank you. It's a clock again. So I'm sick as a dog. So I'm incredibly grateful to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here, and especially to share a panel with two scholars whose work I've admired for a long time, rather daunting, as you can also imagine. And there's nothing I can fault, right? The only thing that would have been amazing is like a brandy with some honey and ginger and so on. So if anybody can rustle that up in the course of the next 40 minutes, that would be fantastic, just in case I don't get to the end of my talk. I'm basically a manager, right? I run a research center, so I write a ridiculous amount of reports and proposals, and I hustle, and I do all kinds of bizarre things that is worlds removed from scholarly thought. So I was very pleased about this invitation because I knew it would be an incredible provocation to reflect quite hard about what it is we think we're doing at the place called the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. So sorry, I have to suck the sweet, so it's no disrespect, it's just otherwise my throat is going to dry up completely. So really what I want to reflect on is what is the practice that we are experimenting with from a knowledge perspective, and how does it pertain to some of the questions that is at the core of this particular symposium. In other words, how do we think about the political, and how do we understand the current conjunction, the moment? The talk is unwieldy, it covers far too much ground, and that's usually what these things are, of course, fantastic for, is like you realize what another person has called how much of your thoughts are just flapping in the wind. They haven't yet kind of crystallized, consolidated. But what I was hoping to do was to start off with reflecting on a set of assumptions that we made quite explicit. So when ACC was started in late 2007, my first job was to write City Futures. And it was an incredible privilege to have the space to reflect about what is going on and in a way set an agenda for something that was being set up from the ground up. And then Vanessa, who's unfortunately left, Watson, was Vanessa still here? No, she has left. She has to catch a plane back. And Sue Parnell and I, we wrote a piece that was published in Progress in Planning in 2009, where we kind of scoped out the kind of epistemic project that Ananya was arguing for just before the break. But scoped it out from the perspective of, I suppose, the situated context of Cape Town, South Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa to some extent. And within that, the trope of sustainability featured strongly. And so this is something that I will come back to, whether there's something within that particular trope that can help us think about the larger questions of political practice, and how do we think critically about the emergent theoretical landscape, about various interpretations of emergent urbanisms. Now, what I want to work through is to, in a way, juxtapose what was a fairly naive way of framing a start, because usually when one gets underway with anything, a good dose of naivete is quite healthy and important, otherwise you won't get anything done, of course. And so the ACC was no different. So yes, there was some explicit reflection, but in a way it was a complete plunge in the dark. We had no idea how you build an interdisciplinary, predominantly applied urban research center in the current moment. We had no idea how do you, if you will, transact the project or the imperatives of intervention in really sticky, complicated, multifaceted contexts, the city where we live, and at the same time contribute to a whole series of larger theoretical and conceptual discourses. And so, until now, the whole affair has been entirely experimental. It's been an open frame, and it's really had only one rule, well, two rules. One is, be as interdisciplinary as possible, and secondly, absolutely absolutely explore the imperative of co-production. Okay, so by co-production, what we mean, and we work off a conception of interdisciplinarity that John Robinson argues for, where you're not necessarily looking at the interfaces at the edges of disciplines, but that you're rather opting for the tradition where you're starting with very particular problematics and bring different experiential and disciplinary lenses to that particular problematic as a way of conducting or undertaking an interdisciplinary project. And so it's quite a fundamental difference to how, of course, within the academy, interdisciplinary is often understood. And what that implies is from the beginning an engagement with the messy, conflicted, and certainly suspect real world of practice. And I want to reflect on what that has meant. But in relation to, I need to press a button. In relation to what I call in my talk, the first section at least, staring into the abyss, right? And this abyss, of course, there's a couple of people who write eloquently about this, but the person who's probably the most captivating must be Mike Davis, right? So most of you would have read Planet of Slums. And what I want to turn your attention to is actually a piece of his in New Left Review, shortly after David Harvey's piece in 2008 that Jim referenced earlier. And so keep in mind the reference to sustainability that I spoke of earlier as a kind of strategic essentialism that we took as an entry point. And Mike Davis argues, of course, there would still be treaties, carbon credits, famine relief, humanitarian acrobatics, and perhaps the full-scale conversion of some European cities and small countries to alternative energy. We won't say a Swedish city. But worldwide adaptation to climate change, which presupposes trillions of dollars of investment in the urban and rural infrastructures of poor and medium-income countries, as well as the assisted migration of tens of millions of people from Africa and Asia, I presume to Europe, would necessarily command a revolution of almost mythic magnitude in the redistribution of income and power. Meanwhile, we are speeding towards a fateful rendezvous around 2030 or even earlier, when the convergent impacts of climate change, peak oil, peak water, and an additional 1.5 billion people on the planet will produce negative synergies, probably beyond our imagination. Now, of course, it is very, very difficult to step back from this assertion. Look at all of the double talk at COP17, COP16, etc. Look at the plethora of fairly transparent modalities of doing absolutely everything possible to abdicate the responsibility to embed it in various really unsatisfactory global agreements and to try and opt out of that. And of course, on the back of the 2008 global financial crisis, all of this has become even more heightened. So I think that there is a very real abyss. And in our own work, we've been engaging with some forecasting work that basically suggests that even if Africa would continue to keep up with its fairly robust GDP growth that it has demonstrated over the last decade, even if it sustains that to 2050, because of Africa's insertion into the nature of its insertion into the global economy and how that feeds, or if you will, combusts through the provision of resources, the new emerging markets that Ananya was talking about. Even if all of that happens, and there's more or less stability and so on, we would still have, with the best possible predictions and conditions, up to 750 million Africans below the $2 poverty line by 2050. We're still talking about GDP per capita numbers of below $1,500 in Eastern and Western Africa by 2050, right? So if you really begin to engage with the magnitude and the scale of, if you will, large-scale abandonment, or if you will, large-scale reproduction of bare life, it is very, very difficult not to feel oneself at the edge of a precipice, at the edge of an abyss. Now, I want to on that note, turn to a recent article by Asher Ming, where he takes a different tack. He particularly takes on the tradition, the recent tradition of deliberative planning, and he kind of, a little bit problematically, kind of conflates both the Foucauldian and the Habermasian traditions within the kind of broader progressive schools of planning. And he draws attention to the fact that with all of the sophistication, provisionality that has come to the theorization of planning and the practices of planning, something really profound has been lost. Their emphasis instead, that's the deliberative planners, falls on motivating visions, scenarios, and diagrams of possibility placed under democratic scrutiny. The strategic role of the planner is not to draw up a plan for implementation, but to offer a vision, to map alternatives. I wonder, however, if something has been lost of the knowing tradition in this otherwise laudable attentiveness to urban complexity and multiplicity, a certain programmatic clarity over the overall aims and priorities of urban living, made all the more necessary in a context of radical uncertainty. Has the attentiveness of deliberative planners to procedures of decision-making compromised the necessity to know about substantive matters of urban change and well-being? Now, I want to use this provocation and return, if you will, to this emergent research practice and its implied epistemologies that we're trying to work on through the ACC. And as you can gather, because I'm a manager, my only research field I have is my own organization, right? So that's a little bit pathetic, especially in a room of anthropologists, but you know, what can I say? I suppose there's a case to be made for institutional ethnography as well. And it's institutional ethnography combined with reflexivity, so you know, I suppose that's acceptable. But in the next section of the paper, there's kind of two fundamental structures. The one is my take of what I see as kind of emergent critical traditions of thought that can help us navigate, if you will, these two poles. The pole of seeing the abyss and seeing nothing else through the abyss, and the pole of suggesting that we have a responsibility to be propositional, that we have a responsibility to not simply critique the inadequacies of neoliberal forms of neoliberalizations of democracy, but that we have a responsibility to also think about alternatives, to be propositional. And my understanding of what this theoretical landscape looks like is something like this. And I'll just kind of read the next sections of the paper because it will be quicker than trying to explain this. Western-centric urban theories are now thoroughly untenable, as Ananya explained, in the wake of post-colonial critique that have masterfully demonstrated the partial, biased, and imperious assumptions embedded in the DNA of these edifices. However, these moves to render cities specific on their own terms has also had a liberating effect on the study of cities in the North, most notably captured in the theoretical manifesto of Amin and Thrift in their Reimagining the City. It is exactly at the intersection of scholars working on northern cities with a non-teleological and emergent ontology that shared concerns are found with theorists attempting to bring the specificity of emergent urbanisms in the South into the frame. This is an exciting and productive development. In this section, I want to take some time to explicate a theoretical landscape that allows for a heterogeneous range of scholars and topics to flourish, all in service of explicating the unique dimensions, folds, temporalities, and emergent pathways of ordinary cities. I'm less adept than Jim at moving my cursor. So let's turn to this first field of Southern urbanisms. In one sense, the entry point for acknowledging the field of Southern urbanism is the sheer demographic momentum that is not only driving the growth of existing and new cities, but also effectively eclipsing the centrality of traditional northern megacities in both the imaginary and economics of the urban. Of course, this demographic shift is the primary preoccupation of urban policy institutions like Habitat, Cities Alliance, and so on. In fact, an ever-increasing number of volumes are appearing that seek to connect the demographic fact of urban intensification with a variety of socioeconomic and ecological problems that it will leave in its wake given weak state capability inadequate infrastructure systems, and limited planning capability. The developmentalist literature is increasingly being reinterpreted and extended to tell a very compelling story about the facts, about the fact that the future of wealth generation lies in the cities of the global south. A widely circulated think piece by the Boston Consulting Group points out that urban consumers in northern cities will only grow by about 100 million people by 2030, compared to a growth pool of 1.3 billion in cities of the global south. Similarly, McKinsey Global Institute has been hard at work at setting the pace in becoming the thought leader, if you will, on what the urbanization opportunity actually means for the investment priorities and decisions of multinational corporations. An emblematic example of this worldview is this really telling table that they produced in their last report, The Urban World, where they rank the top 25 cities in 2025, and they contrast rankings by GDP, GDP per capita, GDP growth, total population, and total households and household consumption, households with a consumption capacity over 20,000. And what emerges is this incredible topography of, in the GDP column, of course, still predominantly cities of the north, and in everything else, the new emerging cities. And if if a wake-up call wasn't needed to for capital that this is an urban century, then certainly this report clearly demonstrates where their future bottom lines will lie. Now, in contradistinction to this kind of engagement with this demographic phenomena, theorist Ananya Roy suggests that there are far more important theoretical work to be done, instead of simply pointing to the self-evident demographic and economic shifts underway. And I quote, instead she argues, it's important, instead Roy seeks to articulate, and I quote, new geographies of urban theory. Doing so requires dislocating the Euro-American center of theoretical production, for it is not enough simply to study the cities of the global south as interesting, anomalous, different, and esoterical empirical cases. Such forms of benign difference-making keep alive the neo-Orientalist tendencies that interpret third world cities as the heart of darkness, as the other. And of course, we've heard a wonderful exposition of this position this morning. She then proceeds to provide a suggestive overview of key theoretical traditions in various southern regions, traditions that through genealogical excavation can prove useful to this new theoretical project. Roy also picks out a number of conceptual frames that have served the Southern Urbanism theoretical project well. A number of volumes have appeared, of course, over the course of the past few years, with the explicit intention of mapping the importance and relevance of theoretical interpretations that arise from Southern contexts. An important theme of this body of work is the focus on detail, specificity, molecular urban practices, and the co-constitutive nature of plural subjectivities and harsh living conditions amidst widespread informality and precarious living conditions. Moving on to the second field, everyday urbanisms. In contrast to the regional interests of Southern urbanisms, everyday urbanism seeks to take subjectivity and multiple social assemblages seriously on their own terms. Over a decade ago, this field was obsessed with informality as a dominant context for both economic and social reproduction. Numerous studies and policy networks were mounted to generate a reasonably complete and fleshed out account of informality. However, much of that work remained trapped in a developmentalist instrumentality, within which the real purpose of research was to understand the obstacles of formalization and address those through effective policy and managerialism. One of the leading theorists in this epistemic field is Abdul Malik Samain, who has for the past 3 decades painstakingly documented and theorized the centrality of everyday life to a larger appropriation of the urban and cityness. In his oeuvre, he has always been less interested in the preoccupation with informality, but rather insisted that a more agnostic sensibility is required. So we find for Simone, and I quote, the point is to pursue the dogged work of trying to understand the implications of what people do, particularly as it is clear that residents, even in the desperate ways they may talk about their lives, usually think about them as more than survival alone. Yes, survival is the overwhelming preoccupation of many, but the pursuit of survival involves actions, relations, sentiments, and opportunities that are more than survival alone. It is these thousands of small excesses which also act on the city, remaking it ever so slightly into something different than it was before. These changes are not measured by any easily discernible standard that allow one to say that the city is becoming more just, equal, cutthroat, revolutionary, messianic, or hellish. And thus the important work is perhaps simply to document these efforts on the part of the poor to give rise to a new moral universe, a sense of value, of potential, and of the unexpected, to which people's attention, no matter how poor, is also paid. Here one can sense Simone's methodological obsession with the infinitesimal pluralism of ordinary life and aspiration, excavated on their own terms, but also with a reluctant normative intent, a recognition that values, spiritual practices, and mores satir everyday life. But these are also profoundly unstable and malleable, and therefore to be understood and projected with great care and provisionality. Simone's work intersects elegantly with the insightful theoretical account of Bayat on the cumulative impacts of mundane transgressions of space, infrastructures, and buildings as the poor enact survival. Bayat suggests that we see these often non-ideological and apolitical practices as a form of encroachment or cannibalization that is simply too pervasive and tenacious to be done away with or oppressed through any kind of simple, or for that matter, complex regime of governmentality. By dint of presence and numbers, everyday acts become a shape and space-forming dynamic that lives deep in the reproductive patterning of southern cities. In this moment, Bayat's work offers a powerful illustration of Roy's thesis that informality has become a dominant mode of urbanization of much of the global south. These lines of argument are fairly compatible with also Solly Benjamin's theorization of occupancy urbanism, but definitely in a different political key than the work on, I would argue, certainly, and we can debate this later, insurgent urbanism that comes from Latin America and, of course, the work of James Holston. However, reading across these contexts and theoretical genres, it is certain that an incredibly rich and protean research program can be found and be imagined and mounted across cities everywhere. However, as more and more carefully crafted, often ethnographic accounts of everyday urbanism start to amass, it is pertinent to draw inspiration from non-representational theorists and begin to question the often human-centered assumptions of this work. Sorry, still no whiskey in sight, but okay. Swedish hospitality, much to be desired, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay, moving on to what I call field 3, vitalist ontologies. Amin and Thrift first explored the implication of a non-essentialist vitalist ontology, of course indebted to Deleuze and Guattari, for a rethinking of cities in their volume. Lorimer explains vitalism as a tradition in philosophy that believes in the existence of a life force in material assemblages that cannot be explained through mechanistic approaches. As an ontology, it argues for the imminent emergence of form rather than the existence of transcendent archetypes. This grounding is a dead giveaway that the leading lights of this particular approach, of course, are actor network theorists such as Latour, Law, and Haraway. And their epistemologies are incredibly closely aligned with this standpoint. In this recent intervention, this quote that I cited from Amin before, and from that same piece, he reminds us that this approach induces a very different and a very expansive understanding of cities and cityness. And I quote, "Cities might be thought of as machinic entities, engines of order, repetition, and innovation, sparked by the clash of elements and bodies that drive the urban experience, including what humans make of themselves, others, and the environment. The urban environment is a meshwork of steel, concrete, natural life, wires, wheels, digital codes, and humans placed in close proximity, and it is the rhythms of the juxtapositions and associations, coming together in symbolic projections, cultural routines, institutional practices, regulatory norms, physical flows, technological regimes, experiences of the landscape, software systems that surge through the human experience. The machinic rhythms of the city, I would argue, blend together the human and the urban condition, making people subjects of a specific kind, where their demeanor and outlook, compared to that of humans in other time spaces, formed by the inhabitation of the urban environment, and most importantly, its inhabitation in them, fixed through these rhythms," end quote. This profoundly relational ontology is coupled to an affective understanding of subjectivity. Again, Lorimer usefully clarifies that affect refers to both material, ecological properties of a body and the forces and processes that link them together. It describes pre-discursive, embodied experiences that are subsequently codified into subjective emotions. These theoretical orientations are decidedly critical of textually oriented post-structural deconstruction on the one hand and neo-Marxist structuralist accounts of inert materialities on the other. Instead, this relational ontology is interested in a much deeper and fuller account of how agency is enacted through particular configurations and emergences of both human and non-human actants in ways that tune into the affective dispositions of people. The net effect is an account of cities that emphasizes the fragility of all that seems inert, stable, gargantuan, immutable, and thoroughly routine. An insightful example of how this ontological account offers a fresh and dynamic perspective on one of the most basic elements of urban life, infrastructure, of course, comes through in the suggestion by Stephen Graham that we are now, in urban theory, experiencing the infrastructural turn. He asks of us to consider urban infrastructures as complex assemblages that bring all manner of human, non-human, and natural agents into a multitude of continuous liaisons across geographic space. This approach forces an engagement with the larger economic, cultural, and social roles of infrastructure discourses, rationalities, and practices. In my mind, since the infrastructural investments occupy central stage in the imagineering and mobilization work of urban elites across the global south, and note Nanya's reference to the $22 billion program for Indian cities alone, it is vital that we deploy vitalist ontologies and related insights from relational understandings encapsulated by the notion of assemblages to theorize more broadly about the emergent practices and consequences of city building. This, Jane Bennett argues, will open us up to look for and recognize the constitutive turbulence of materialities that on the surface may appear stable and solid. Given the incomplete and under-constructedness of cities in the South, taking on board this relational stance to reality in the making and knowledge can only contribute to a more plural and dynamic conception of city making and cityness. More importantly, it allows us to connect the unjust and cruel pathways of our cities to a clearer set of analytical programs to speak into the challenge of proposition intimated by Amin. This takes me to my final field of theory building, which is ecological urbanism. In keeping with the vitalist ontology and recognizing the variable assemblages of actants that support the relentless social natural reproduction of the city, it is clear that the central concern of urban studies is turning towards the longer-term viability of contemporary models of urban development, design, and material reproduction. It demands a careful and systematic consideration of multiple pathways towards alternative, more resilient, and more livable forms and modalities of habitation. Central to this concern is an interest in the natural social assemblages of the city as mediated by infrastructure networks and the built environment. As Graham again explains, energy, water, sewage, transport, trade, finance, and communication infrastructures allow modern urban life to exist. Their pipes, ducts, service, wires, conduits, electronic transmissions, and tunnels sustains the flows, connections, and metabolisms that are intrinsic to contemporary cities. Through the endless technological agency, these systems help transform the natural into the cultural, the social, and the urban. Similar observations can be extended to the role of the built environment as mediators and embodiments of urban functionalities, form, symbolic projection, and the desires for control. Mohsen Mostafavi argues that these readings, set against a backdrop of environmental risk and crisis, open up an opportunity to project new imaginaries of alternative urbanisms. Such visions or projections should not arise from a technocratic eschewing of structural crisis, but rather stem from a perspective that views the fragility of the planet and its resources as an opportunity for speculative design innovations, rather than as a form of technical legitimation for promoting conventional solutions. In mainstream neoliberal inflected discourses, speculative design translates into an agenda about environmental security and the promise of a technological fix. And instructive development can be seen in the scramble by various insurance, engineering, and financial service companies to understand what the investment potential and risk profile of so-called sustainable infrastructures are. This fraction of the knowledge-driven service economy, intermarried with the engineering manufacturing sectors, coalesce to produce ecological urban utopias unmoored from the messy and leaky materialities of most places. And our classic example of this kind of design conceit is Mostar, of course, or the proposals for similar free-floating technologically wet dreams. But in this yearning for a technological remedy rooted in reductionism, there also lies an unprecedented opportunity for developing and projecting a radically different imaginary to frame prospective ecological urbanisms. I'll come back to this a little later on. Now, works in this epistemic field counterbalances the obsessions with only the everyday. But in thinking about longer temporalities, it also remains modest and provisional by keeping in view the constitutive dynamic of uncertainty and risk, and the always present potentiality of unforeseen emergences and assemblages of actions. This then brings me to what one could call the connective tissue between these deliberatively stylized and, of course, false categories of scholarship. The diagrammatic sketch that you see on the screen clearly suggests that on the vertical axis, there is a continuum between quantitative research that can help us to understand the dimensions, patterns, and categories of city formation unfolding across the global south, which I think can, in the way Jenny Robinson has recently been thinking about comparative work, or it can kind of really provide a useful informant to that. This foregrounding is important because it asks of us to move beyond the absurd pitching of qualitative against quantitative methods, especially in the wake of the post-structural and post-colonial turns. That said, it also reinforces the idea that without much more investment in carefully crafted accounts of the intimacies of everyday life, practices and dispositions of urban majorities, we are unlikely to deepen and evolve the emergent theorizations of everyday urbanisms. But in this recommitment, there's also a call to broaden our ontological assumptions to really begin to look beyond either individual or collective agency and situate such practices in more affectively attuned accounts of various assemblages of chains of actors and emergent intensities. The second horizontal axis speaks to the political sensibility that arises from the movements between those overlapping and mutually enriching fields of inquiry and theoretical curiosity. On the one hand, in light of the abyss, so powerfully drawn by Davis and his tribe, we do not give up on the possibility of being able to identify a series of concrete and precise politics of action and intervention, but of course rooted in a heightened reflexivity and sense of provisionality. At the same time, looking across the spectrum that range from a concern with pragmatic interventions in the now, there is an acknowledgement that the excess produced by the abyss, so leave us yearning for answers, consolations, a basis for hope, I suppose. Amidst the impossibility of political relief in philosophical terms, it is inevitable that one turns to the ethical underpinning of this political and epistemological stance. This ethics, I believe, must draw its inspiration from the continuous exploration into the aesthetics and poetic dimension of imponderable futures, and how such futures are always met in one way or another with a determination to act, a refusal to cede ground to hopelessness and defeat. But because we are talking about debates and questions that are beyond rational resolution, there is a vital requirement to conjure a deeper and more affectively attuned conception of experiences, of the importance of the moment, and how the experience gives rise to a determined search to transcend. And in this, it is not the transcendence that is important, but rather the aesthetic and poetic resolution of that yearning. Here, my interviews with artists who engage with the contemporary urban condition are instructive. These artists all suggest that the moment of resolving an artwork, albeit a painting, a musical score, a poem, or a public art intervention, is experienced as a breakthrough. This arrival is, of course, a uniquely individualized moment of clarity and release, which may only play itself out in the affective realm and not necessarily cognitively. Yet it feels like something has been resolved, allowed to unmoor itself from the weight of hopelessness, despair, and pain. And in that, I would argue, there is an equally important political moment to the pragmatics of intervention. One of the benefits of this diagrammatic conceptual frame, with all its limitations that comes with any typology, is it allows us to assess theorizations of the emergent urban in the South. That in that assessment, it forces one to recognize a variety of political moments and opportunities. Okay, I should conclude. I'm kind of running out of time. So in the next section, I kind of stitch together, or I frame up this work by referring back to the argument around relational politics that I developed in City Futures, where I suggested that in any urban setting, there are, if you will, 5 moments of political practice. There's the kind of official, democratically elected or not so democratically elected political forums, and the kind of assortment of participatory mechanisms that gets attached or hooked onto those. Secondly, you often have these neo-corporatist political forums where there's a stylized negotiation about mega priorities, labor, business, government, and so on. Thirdly, you have this vast arena of direct action or mobilization against state policies or to advance very specific particular demands. Fourthly, there's a politics of development practice, which is often reflected in a whole range of things that is ameliorative, welfare-orientated, but often also important, if you will, prefigurations of the capacity for citizenship and engagement in collective action, even if not critical. And finally, especially in the media-saturated societies, symbolic political contestation as expressed through discursive contestation in the public sphere. And what I argue is that you always have to try and triangulate between these 5 different moments of the urban political as a way of understanding how a particular issue either comes onto the agenda or is engaged with and so on. Now from that, can I take another 5 minutes? Is that okay? Or too much?
Yes, you have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm not taking it. I'm using my 5 minutes. However, in turning to our gathering here, the symposium, and this work that I've done in the past, and how much of our concerns, I was struck by how much of our concerns about political opportunity structures and state-civil society interfaces is obsessed with the now, with the contemporary dynamics of exclusion and differential inclusion. However, going back to Amin's earlier injunction for a more propositional and programmatic agenda that substantively addresses how different futures could be induced, I want to suggest that we consider a further elaboration on that point by him. And he suggests it is not possible for planners to draw up an urban program without the pretensions of it. Sorry, it is not possible for planners to draw up an urban program without the pretensions of total vision, teleological fulfillment, and systemic certitude, offering a clear diagnosis of the threats that cities face, the matters of collective concern, that must be addressed, the goals that must be defended to improve urban living for the many and not the few. Why is this not possible, he asks. It seems to me that the rereading of the theoretical landscapes also offers some clues for how to transcend the obsession with the contemporary and move towards a consideration of multiple temporalities, scales, and socio-technical intensities and patterns. In my reading of the literature on urban politics, it seems that the general assumption is that neoliberal programs of urban entrepreneurship forms the context for collective struggles. These struggles are typically about recognition by powerful vested interests, typically urban growth coalitions, in order to access some basics of urban life, whether it be sanitation, land, energy, transportation, whatever. And in contexts where these struggles are relatively matured or marked by periodic victories, these material claims are increasingly connected to larger discourses about accessing rights, as James Holston reminded us this morning. In some contexts, depending on post-colonial political traditions, the rights discourses may prefigure these material struggles and serve as a backdrop for these kinds of claim-making and encroachments. Alongside and or before these materially based processes of claim-making, there is often a need to elementary claims to ensure the seizure or moderation of violent repression which can take the form of extortion, forced removals, or the constant threat thereof, or willful withholding of access to services when local populations are deemed to have transgressed the realm of the politically acceptable in the eyes of the state or local power brokers. Central to most accounts of these wide-ranging social struggles is a deep belief that local states are absolutely guided by programs of neoliberal governmentality. Evidence of this is provided through exhibits that demonstrate the fiscal predilection for economic boosterism projects at the expense of more equitable and just priorities, or institutional reform measures that introduce market-based operational systems and incentives, which either manifest in the corporatization of a municipal entity or its outright privatization. These kinds of reforms typically reinforce patterns of splintered urbanism and an effective withdrawal of the local state from the lives and neighborhoods of poor citizens. Another telltale sign of neoliberalization of city governments is the penchant for institutional and investment reforms this is embarrassing. Investment reforms that fall in line with aspirations to become world-class and globally competitive. It is not the focus of this paper to explore the rich literature that traces the various locally specific adaptation and extension of basic neoliberal precepts that inform urban management. But I think Anania's earlier point about an indigenous neoliberalization is an interesting one to reflect on. All I want to signal is that there is now an important debate about how useful and historically accurate these taken for granted assumptions are about the widespread adoptions and execution of neoliberal intentionality. Here I'm referring to the recent and suggestive work of Jennifer Robinson and Sue Purnell on this topic. All I want to signal for now is that this questioning is opening up a much needed space to understand a variety of logics, intentionality, and assemblages that fractions within local states and elites are caught up in, no least of which is the force of law, in navigating the routine dynamics of city administration, management, symbolic articulation, and constant ideological recalibration of highly media-driven publics. But let us hold that thought for now. Going back to the earlier point, my central contention is that investigations into the terrain of the urban political are overly obsessed with the now. The present struggles over incredibly fundamental and crucial questions of basic protection against state violence, access to essential services, and the fundamental right to simply be in the city are and remain critical. These are, of course, undeniably important and continues to be a relevant foci of scholarship. But is it adequate to fully comprehend the wide-ranging surges of intent, fear, desire, aspiration, and technological imperatives that secure the variety of human and non-human assemblages that underpin the built environment and the urban social? In light of the earlier discussion on redrawing the theoretical landscape that can inform city studies, I want to suggest that we can respond to the injunction of Amin by opening a relational political field that is not only multiscalar, but also alert to multiple folds of time that coexist and co-constitute the present. For example, a decision to compete for a mega event locks a city into all manner of predetermined choices in order to comply with the stringent global standards that accompanies the paid-for honor to host these boosterism parties. It also changes the order of public investment priorities with a knock-on effect of probably 10 to 20 years, if not more. Similarly, the continuous decision-making apparatus that bind together municipal managers, engineers, professional bodies, academic knowledges about technological preference and system maintenance imperatives, particularly financial instruments and markets, client expectation, etc., lead to investment framings and priorities that carve all manner of path dependencies. These may or may not conform to explicit neoliberal calculations, but most importantly, they are instantiated into the reproductive dynamic of the city through largely invisible and therefore unproblematized processes. There are two kinds of routine decision-making and implementation assemblages that I would suggest need more critical scrutiny. Again, following Graham, the first pertains to the ubiquitous role of network infrastructures in structuring urban opportunities and potentialities for citizens of various classes and locations, firms of various sizes and sectors, and of course, nature in its diverse systemic layers and intersections. The second is the built form, understood as a dynamic amalgam of land use, transportation, built form, and typologies, spatial layout, and density. If our political gaze would lift its eyes from the compelling immediacy of urban struggles of the poor and turn to the ways in which framing discourse and assumption about key operating systems of the city, a very different series of political claims and imaginings can present itself. I need a minute to just wrap it up. Okay. So what I conclude with is basically an argument that we can be in this moment of thinking about different futures and thinking about the possibility of different futures, that there's a way of framing a very different political conversation about what I call the operating systems of cities in a relational frame. And within each of these operating systems, there are very important claims to be made about alternatives, about projective alternatives, about programmatic alternatives. And within that, all of these can be done in a way that draws from emergent struggles. So this is not some technocratic idealized agenda, but this is rather an understanding of where, if you will, expert judgment and grassroots emergent struggles intersect to build different imaginaries and different possibilities within a relational frame, as I explained earlier. So finally, what does this all mean? And I'm kind of skipping a bit. It means the implications of our discussion about urban politics, I think 5 things, and I won't elaborate, I'm just listing them and then I'll shut up. The politicization of everything, especially the future, and the city region as opposed to the slum settlement. Secondly, the reordering and rearticulation of diverse political openings and moments. Thirdly, the rethinking of network and coalition politics. Fourthly, a serious consideration of what one can only call, in this traumatic moment of statehood, institutional retrofitting, which is an engagement about how does the local state learn? How does one induce accountability? How does one instill adaptive capacity? How does one make sure that there's the capability for co-production? And finally, and this is another big argument, but I think what knits these things together and where there's a really exciting moment in rethinking the political is thinking about a design sensibility as a framing logic to tie some of this together. I'll have to stop there. Thank you.